All right, folks. Again, welcome. We're going to get the program rolling here. I'm Dave Sly, Conservation Director. Well, actually, I changed my title. Water Quality Program Director at Wild Virginia. Um, and I wanted to introduce to start with Kylie McClatchy, also from Wild Virginia, and Julian Steins, who's one of our great interns this semester. They'll be helping keep me on track, hopefully. And then I'll get to Brian here in a couple minutes, but first, just a little of the ground rules here. We are recording this, of course, as a webinar. You're not on screen, and so you won't show up in case you're worried about that. Feel free to go to the chat box and introduce yourself. Let us know who's here, maybe where you're from, or whatever you'd like to tell us, and your fellow attendees. During the program, you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and towards the end, we'll try to address those as best we can. Depending on how many there are, hopefully we can get to all of them. And just know that you will get a follow-up email with a link to the recording and other information that can be helpful to you. And make sure you share that. Now, everybody who registered, whether they couldn't make it or not, will get all that information too. But it'll be available for people in the future. I had to do a little commercial for Wild Virginia just to encourage you to stick with us if you're not already a longtime supporter, which I know some of you are. Our programs are very targeted. We have a connectivity program which looks at or works to make sure our natural areas are connected, that we have ecosystems that work for both animals and for people, trying to protect, all those beings moving across the land. My program focuses on water quality, and that includes has included and continues to include fighting bad projects like destructive pipelines, um, fighting to try to keep dangerous chemicals like PFAS out in the environment. And then we have educational programs like this in general, but we also have a special program we started several years ago called Clean Water Advocates. And it's a really kind of an intensive 8-week course that people go through to learn about the legal and regulatory structures, but also how they can be involved and really affect decisions that are made. So that's kind of the short story of Wild Virginia. Hopefully you'll continue to follow us. Again, as you've registered for this, you're on our list. So look out for all the things that are coming up. We do a pretty wide variety of programs, and so I think you'll find something to interest you, no matter what your background or what your interests are. Um, and of course, you can scan that or go to wildvirginia.org and join us, support us. We really depend on you. It allows us to go to decision makers and say, "Hey, we got all these people behind us and working with us." That's important. So, with all that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to introduce you to Brian Richter. You probably saw his bio, and I'm not going to go through the extensive, great stuff that's in there. I'll tell you that I've known him for quite a few years now, and respect him and his work greatly. And I'm really just so pleased that he agreed to be with us tonight. And I always learn a lot when I get to hear him speak, and I know you will too. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Brian, and let you go.
Well, thanks very much, Dave. I'll go ahead and get my mine all set up here, and all right. I think we're going to be good to go here. I'm going to move this out of my way so I can see what I'm doing. Um, yeah, a particularly loud shout out to Mexico City in the UK. I saw on some of the ones some of the identifications that were coming in. Um, so is everybody seeing my screen? Okay, let's start there. We're all good? Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about a subject tonight that's a little bit different or unusual for those of you that are that have been living here in Virginia. Although I will say that we certainly, if you've been here for a while, then you might remember that even in Charlottesville, Virginia, or even on the Atlantic seaboard, we have experienced in the past some pretty frightening water scarcity challenges, some water shortages in our communities, particularly in 2001 and 2002, when we hit a drought of record here on the East Coast. But let me show you. Here's what I'm going to try to cover tonight. So I want to talk a little bit about how our use of water has changed over time, going back into long human history, very briefly. I want to then carefully explain to you how we get into trouble with water scarcity. It's a concept that is a little bit difficult for a lot of people to comprehend initially. So I want to make sure I walk carefully through that and give you some simple explanations as to how that happens. I'll say just a little bit about how climate change is coming into play here, but it is in many parts of the world, it is intensifying our water challenges. And then, of course, I'm going to try to end on a little bit of an optimistic note and talk about the things that we can do about this problem or about these challenges. So let's start with the long human history. Those of you who know your human history know that about 10 to 12,000 years ago, there was a very important shift in the way that some populations, some communities of human beings were making a living. There are some very substantial lifestyle changes. And of course, this is the time period during which some places in the world we saw people start to move from the hunter-gatherer mode of living and starting to become more sedentary, starting to become more agricultural. And I bring this up and want to start here for context because I've often said that this was one of the biggest bets that humanity has ever made. And the reason that I say that is we went from a mode of human operation where we would traverse the landscape and in some cases over long, long distances, not just in the pursuit of food supplies, but also in the pursuit of reliable water supplies. So knowing where distant springs were, knowing where rivers would stay perennial throughout the year was a big part of human migrations originally. And when we decided to start to settle into one place, our bet was that the water was going to come to us, that there was going to be sufficient water, reliable water supplies that would come to the place that we were setting roots in, that we were becoming settled in. And of course, over time, in the recent history, in the last couple of hundred years, we have been doing all sorts of things to try to hedge against that very, very big water bet. And one of the most important, certainly, is the idea of being able to capture water and to store it so that we could use it at a later time. And this is particularly important in places where you have seasonal water supplies. In other words, maybe you live in a snowmelt region and most of your water comes when the snowpacks melt in the springtime and the water comes rushing down. But in many places around the world, the greatest need for water is to grow food and to use it in irrigated agriculture. And so being able to store water from the wet, rainy season or during the snowmelt period and hold on to that water to be able to use it at other drier times of the year has been a very, very important strategy. And it's going to that strategy is going to be central to some of the stories that I'm going to share with you tonight. So at the time, this is Hoover Dam in Lake Mead. It says there, at the time Hoover Dam was built, it was the largest dam in the world. It was completed in 1932. And that dam, along with one more upstream, which is Lake Powell, up above upstream of the Grand Canyon, between those two reservoirs, they're able to store 4 years worth of the Colorado River's flow. And I should have said that. This is on the Colorado River out in the western US. Another strategy was was to try to tap underground water. And I can only imagine that this happened, perhaps people observing wildlife that would go into a dry stream bed and scratch at the sand to get to, pools of water that existed down in the sands, at a little bit of depth. But over time, so initially we may have started to, utilize some of that hidden water ourselves, but over time, and particularly once we gained access to the technology of large scale, powerful industrial pumps, then we could access groundwater that wasn't just a couple few feet underground, but literally more than hundreds, if not now more than thousands of feet below the ground. And so these are not alien circles here that you're seeing on the screen. This is out in the High Plains Aquifer, a very, very extensive groundwater aquifer out in Kansas, but it goes across the entire Midwest. And each of those circles, in the center of each of those circles, is a groundwater well with a big pump on it. And most of these circles have groundwater wells that are hundreds of feet deep, some of them more than 1,000 feet deep. And they're able to pump that water using powerful pumps, bring it to the surface. And the reason it's circular is there's a rack of sprinklers that are out on an arm, and that arm rotates around that crop circle. So it goes around and around here, and they call this a center pivot sprinkler system. So the well's right in the center there, and it's irrigating the crops around a circle where the sprinklers can reach. Another way of hedging the bet was to go get water from a distant place and bring it to that place that you'd settle in. And so you see places like the State Water Project in California. It moves water from Northern California, which has much more abundant water supplies, and takes it all the way into Southern California, moves it over hundreds of miles. There are other places like in China with the South North Water Diversion Project, which takes water out of the Yangtze River in the southern part of the country and pumps and transports it all the way into northern China, which is their vast agricultural region and also where the capital of Beijing exists. So we have learned how to move water across large distances and bring it to where we need it for use. So those are the primary strategies that we've used historically. And these are the strategies that make it possible for us to have over 5 million people living in a place like Phoenix that gets only 7 inches of rain a year. And so our technological advancements with water have really enabled us to situate our populations in some of the driest places on Earth. And that bet has worked for a long period of time. And in a lot of places, as I'm going to show you, it's not working out so well anymore. So let's talk very briefly and simply as I can about what water scarcity means. And specifically the most common question I've been asked in my presentations over the decades has been, explain to me how we run out of water. Because for most people, they grew up in grade school being taught about this global water cycle, right? And you might remember that basically the concept is that water evaporates off the surface of the ocean in particular, but it can also evaporate off of lakes and other areas on the land surface. But most of the evaporation is taking place out in the ocean. That evaporation, that water that's evaporating rises up into the atmosphere, it condenses into clouds, and then those clouds are blown on the winds onto the land, and then they drop that moisture in the form of rainfall or snow, what we collectively call precipitation. They precipitate on the land surface, and then that water might soak into the soils and get into underground water, what we call groundwater, or it might run down creeks and streams and rivers out of higher areas, out of mountains, and eventually, enter into lowlands. And so we see this here in our region. A lot of water falls on, say, the Blue Ridge Mountains and then flows out onto the coastal plain, and that's part of the water source, part of the water supplies that we enjoy here, for example, in Charlottesville, Virginia. So what I try to say at this point is the reason people get confused about running out of water is because they say, well, don't we have the same amount of water moving through the global water cycle that we've always had? And the answer, of course, is yes. For literally billions of years, we've had largely the same volume of water on our planet, moving around in different ways and at different times in different places around the globe. But taken as a whole, it's the same volume of water throughout long history. So at this point, I try to tell people forget about the global water cycle because um, primarily because if you think about it, living in Charlottesville, Virginia, or wherever any of you are, we can technologically access water out of the Congo River in Africa, but we can't afford to do that in any kind of an economical way. So yeah, we could send a tanker ship over to the mouth of the Congo River and bring that water over here to the eastern coast of the United States, but it would cost too much for the vast majority of us to be able to afford that water being brought in from that far away. So instead, we really need to think about um, the local water supplies that each of our community relies upon tend to be quite local in nature. The local river. It's the local water that's underground from some aquifer, beneath our feet. Um, and I'll here use the metaphor of a bathtub. We can talk about our local water account or our local bathtub, and it is either a river or an aquifer, typically maybe a lake, or any combination of those things. And so here in Charlottesville, for example, our water account, our bathtub is the water coming down the Rivanna River. That's the water that we depend upon. We aren't using water from, the Mississippi River. We aren't using water from, snow melt in New England. We're using local water supply, and that's the account that matters to us when we talk about water scarcity and our vulnerability to water shortages. And so going back to the bathtub metaphor, what's important is to not let the outflow or the consumption of water become greater than the inflow. And so a bathtub here works pretty well, actually. If the drain, representing the water that we're consuming, um, or the water going out of our local community, is becomes greater than the amount coming in through the spigot, as shown in this bathtub cartoon, then then what happens? Then the level of the bathtub starts to go down. If the drain is moving faster, representing use of water, gets faster than the replenishment of the water coming in through the spigot, then you have an imbalance. Then you have a deficit and the water level goes down. What does that mean? Well, that means that the river dries up. It means that the groundwater aquifer starts to become depleted. It means the lake dries up. It means the reservoirs dry up. So it's this simple balance. You can think about it as your bank account. If you're writing more checks than you're depositing money in your checking account, you eventually overdraft. You eventually go into bankruptcy. And so this is the simple concept that I think really helps you to get your head around how can we run out of water. What happened to us in Charlottesville back in 2002 was we were in a very long extended drought. We couldn't reduce our water use fast enough to bring it down to the level of replenishment that we were experiencing at that time. So our water supply reservoirs in the Charlottesville area began to dry up. And it became very serious. We got to a point where we were within months of drying up our reservoirs and running out of water supply here in Charlottesville. So this can happen, this phenomena of getting out of balance between the consumption and the replenishment can happen even in a place like Charlottesville, where we're getting 45 to 50 inches of rain on average per year. This isn't something that only happens in places like Phoenix, Arizona. or in the desert regions of the world. And so here's a different way of representing that concept. So this is the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. It is the biggest river system in Australia, the most important from a standpoint of producing food. And what this shows you is over about 100-year span of time, the light blue part of this graph, this is just representing volume of water year after year over time. And so the light blue part of this graph is how much water is available, is being replenished in the Murray-Darling River system. And you can see it's highly variable over time. It goes up and down between years, some very high, some quite low. The darker blue is, as it's labeled there, the water use, the consumption of water. And over time, the consumption of water, as in many places around the world, steadily grew over time and got to a point where out here, they started to get pretty close to consuming all of the water that was coming down the Murray-Darling River system each year. And right here, they decided to start putting some restrictions on not allowing that water consumption to continue to grow. But unfortunately, it was a little bit too little too late. And what's called the Millennium Drought, also called the Big Dry, came on in the late 1990s, lasted for about 10 to 12 years in this part of southeastern Australia. And all of a sudden, they were only getting about 40% of the water supply that they had been getting on average, for the century previous to this drought. This was their drought of record. And so as the water supply began to crash, began to come down, their consumption of water had to also be reduced because you just can't use water that you don't have. And so farms ran out of water. They had a major economic disruption. Farmers went out of business. It wiped out their rice industry. It wiped out their dairy industry in Australia. And it was very, very tragic for a lot of farmers. Many of them committed suicide, unfortunately, during this time period, to give you some sense as to how severe that was. And so that was a case where they couldn't balance their water consumption or get their water consumption down to a level commensurate with how much was being replenished, how much was coming down the river system, and they had a catastrophe as a result. So this phenomena of getting out of balance, having your consumption become equal to or greater than the replenishment is happening all over the world. It's taking place in about a third of all the river basins and groundwater aquifers in the world. You can see the colors here. Any place that's not in a gray color is experiencing these water shortages. The only reason for the differences in the color is that the yellow areas are places where this only happens when they have a drought, when they have a string of dry years, like what we had in Charlottesville in 2001 and 2002. The orange color is they experience this during times of the year when their water consumption is greatest. For example, they're using a lot of irrigation to grow crops during the summer season. And during that season, they're using more water than is being replenished during that season. And so they experience an imbalance and can experience water shortages during that time. The deep maroon or red color are places that are just chronically experiencing water shortages all the time. I'll point out here in the Midwest, this is the High Plains Aquifer, also known as the Ogallala Aquifer, and they are very, very much dependent upon groundwater aquifer, and they are always pumping more out of that aquifer system now than is being replenished or what we say recharged back into that aquifer. So you see the stats down here. I mentioned this is happening in about a third of the Earth's surface. But about a half of the world's population is being affected because that's where people live, are in these same places where we're experiencing these problems. and 3/4 of the world's irrigated farmland is being affected. So this is a very serious issue for farming, very serious issue for producing the food that we all depend upon. As a consequence, when this happens, a variety of impacts can be expected. It can affect people's livelihoods, their personal health, their hygiene. If you're having to go to a place like this and dig down in the riverbed and to scrounge for, a meager puddle of water, the quality of that water, the amount of that water is going to be very difficult to access and not really of desirable and appropriate water quality. And that can cause problems. You can have crop failures when you don't have enough water to irrigate. And so widespread famines are taking place around the world during these times when the need for water has gotten to be greater than the reliable supply, the replenishment of water. And it also is having a very, very big impact on our natural ecosystems, our wetlands, our springs, our riparian areas, also even in our large rivers. This is the Klamath River back in around the year 2000, 2001. They had a very, very long extended drought. The Klamath River dropped to very low levels. When rivers drop to low levels, there's not as much oxygen available in the water because the warmth is really sucking a lot of that oxygen out of the water. And so fish who depend upon that oxygen that's in the water can suffer and die as a result of that. And so that's just one. These are just a few of the examples of the myriad ways in which human beings and other species can be heavily impacted by these water shortages. So for those of you that are interested in this, you can go to my website, sustainablewaters.org, and on there you'll see a map. And you can go into this map and click on any of the dots that are on this map, and it'll pop up an explanation about what happened during a water shortage in each of these places. And you can see that this is happening all over the world. I've had my students at the University of Virginia over many semesters populating this database. And so the map has got quite a few examples of where these problems are occurring around the world. So I'm going to turn now to a real world example, one that's been in the news all the time. I think probably all of you have heard that there's quite a crisis that's emerging in the Colorado River system out in the southwestern United States. And I want to explain to you why this crisis has come about and some of the things that are being attempted to try to manage their way through this crisis. So here's a similar graph to what I showed you for the Murray-Darling River. This one for the entirety of the Colorado River. Again, volume of water coming down the river in the light blue in the background here. The darker blue is the water being consumed, meaning it's taken out of the river and not replaced. So it's consumption of water. And the really amazing thing about the story of the Colorado River for me, this is one of the things that has confused me, let's say, for decades, as to why way back here in the mid 1950s, we almost dried up the Colorado River way back then. 75 years ago, we almost dried up the entire Colorado River, and yet nobody put any constraints on the growth of more and more water being consumed from that river system. And so you see repeated times subsequently when we actually consumed more water than had come down the river during these years. And it's happening more and more frequently. And so you might be scratching your head now and saying, okay, so how do you use more water than the river is providing in any given year? And the answer is the magic of those big reservoirs that I showed you earlier. So in each of these yellow bubbles out here on the right, when our consumption of water was greater than how much came down the river in each of those years, and there are spans of years, as you can see, multiple years in some cases. We took water out of those big reservoirs and used it to make up the difference. Okay? So we sucked water out of the reservoirs to make up the deficit. And so what has happened is because this has happened in 3 out of every 4 years since the year 2000, we keep taking more and more out of the reservoirs. The reservoirs are going dry. They're dropping really, really fast. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, is now more than two-thirds empty. That means it's lost 156 feet, as indicated by this white, what we call the bathtub ring around the reservoir. That's where the rock is stained white because the water level used to be up here at the top of the white band. And the water carries a lot of minerals, a lot of salts. And so the water stains the rock. And that's why it shows up as that band. That band is 156 feet high. It continues to lose water every year. It's going to lose a lot of water this year. We're having the driest year in the Colorado River system since we started recording the flow of water in that river system, way back near the turn of the last century. So over more than 100 years, we have not seen a drier year than what we're experiencing this year. And so Lake Mead is going to plummet more. Lake Powell, similarly, is three-quarters empty. That it's hard to tell from this picture, but their bathtub ring is 171 feet tall, and it lost a lot of water. It lost 32 feet during the last year. Okay, so hopefully everybody's tracking here that this is like going into your savings account when you're overspending your checking account and you're borrowing money out of the savings account. And if you're not replenishing the savings account, and if your checking account continues to be overdrawn, you deplete your savings account pretty rapidly. Okay, now I'm going to, as simply as I can, explain to you why we're looking at a catastrophe that's almost unimaginable in the Colorado River and in the Grand Canyon. And so this is where the reservoir level would be if Lake Powell was full. This is the big Grand Canyon Dam that I just showed you in that last picture. At this level, this is where most of the water, this is where all of the water that goes through the Grand Canyon is released out of Grand Canyon Dam, and it goes out of this pipe. That pipe feeds turbines, penstocks that generate electricity. So we're generating electricity for millions of Americans by releasing this water through the dam. It spins these turbines, and then it empties out in the Colorado River downstream of Grand Canyon Dam. Okay? We're getting at sometime later this year, summer or fall, the water level in Lake Powell is going to drop down below that pipe. That is crisis time when that happens, and it's coming, and it's pretty much inevitable. This crisis is baked in the oven now. We can't really do a whole lot to keep it from happening. It's a crisis because even though there are some additional pipes lower down in the reservoir, they were never meant to pass large volumes of water. They were installed when the dam was built simply as a way to route water around the construction zone so that the workmen could get into the main part of the river and build the dam. They're not meant to carry, large volumes of water downstream through the Glen Canyon and downstream into Lake Mead. And this is really truly a big crisis that is about to unfold, and that we're going to see it happening later on this year. So as I say, it's almost unimaginable to think that this beautiful blue-green ribbon of water that formed the Grand Canyon over millions of years could actually dwindle to a trickle here later on this year. But that's the reality that we're looking at. And That water, again, I'll remind you, goes downstream to Lake Mead and supplies 30 million people with drinking water supplies. So when this runs to a trickle, you're going to see an awful lot of people getting very surprised and very upset, not to mention millions of acres of farmland that's being irrigated to grow our food that we all depend upon. 90% of America's green vegetables, green leafy vegetables during the winter season comes from an area far downstream here called the Imperial Irrigation District. And so this is going to be a shockwave um, from public water supply, irrigation supplies, and a big hammer on electricity generation and on the overall economies. And of course, people like myself that like to enjoy the recreational benefits of a magnificent place like this. The river's going to dry to the point where you're not going to be able to float a boat down the Colorado River system beginning later on this year. How long will it last? We don't know. It depends upon what the snowfall does next year. And it's going to drive some beautiful species closer to extinction. This has always been my favorite beast on the planet. It's called the Colorado pike minnow. It's found in no other place in the world other than in the Colorado River. It's highly endangered, and this catastrophe, this man-made catastrophe, could push species like the Colorado pike minnow over the edge. This is a fish that historically grew to 6 feet in length and over 100 pounds in weight. Was once a major food supply for Native Americans and for early settlers in the western United States. I'm going to only touch on this very briefly in the interest of time, but underneath the ground, as we have run out of water in the river system, farmers and cities have turned to pumping that underground water that lies underneath the Colorado River Basin much, much more heavily. And the depletion of water, the sucking of water out of those aquifers, that volume is 5 times greater than what we're doing to the big reservoirs that I just showed you a moment ago. So this level of water consumption, I think you're getting the picture here. It's highly unsustainable. I'm not going to dwell on these numbers, but I want to show you some work that we've been doing recently. This is how much water we are losing from storage in reservoirs and groundwater aquifers per year. This is how much water we depend upon on average each year out of the Colorado River system and the groundwater aquifers. And so the calculation here is that presently the level of overconsumption, the unsustainable consumption is on the average of about 13%. But this average was taken over the last 2 decades. Right now, it's greater than 20%. So in order to rebalance and save this river system and all that we depend upon, we're going to have to reduce our consumption very quickly by more than 20% to get out of this challenge. Okay, and so presently, on long-term average, 87% of the water is being naturally replenished from snowmelt, river flow, rainfall, groundwater recharge. The rest is coming out of rating our water savings account, rating our reservoirs and our aquifers. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm hitting you with a hammer, but it's going to be more challenging in the future because of climate warming. Climate warming has already reduced the flow of the Colorado River by about 10%. As we look out into the coming decades, the climate scientists are saying it's going to get a lot worse, and we should expect between 20% and 35% less water coming down the Colorado River by the year 2050. So, needless to say, we've got some enormous challenges for everybody that depends upon the Colorado River and everything that we, by extension, derive from that river system: electricity, food supplies, drinking water. Just a quick note to mention that we've done similar analyses. My extended research group has done just completing work for the Rio Grande system, the Colorado River system, the Great Salt Lake, Snake River in Idaho, the Platte River out on the in the Midwest, eastern Colorado and Wyoming and Nebraska, and also for the Central Valley in California. I'll just point you to the far right column, the level of overconsumption. I'm about to move to New Mexico, and this is not good news for us that more than half of the water being consumed in the Rio Grande Basin is unsustainable. Only half is coming from natural replenishment. The Great Salt Lake, you may have heard also, is in dire straits. The Great Salt Lake is shrinking because we're 24% overuse out of the Great Salt Lake, or I should say, the rivers that feed the Great Salt Lake. But everywhere, not looking good. We need to really make some pretty substantial changes really fast. So I'm going to go into kind of hyper mode here, trying not to shortchange the good news and what we're going to be able to do or what we're trying to do. So, what should we do to try to address this problem? Um, the first principle when you're dealing with a water shortage crisis is to really understand how the water is being consumed. And so, this is how the Colorado River in total is being used. If you factor in reservoir evaporation, the natural vegetation and wetlands along the river, that's what the water pie looks like. If you look only at the human uses, about three quarters is going to ag and a quarter is going to the cities. And then if you take and look at that agricultural part of the pie, this is where the water's going. So three quarters of the water that humans depend upon in the Colorado River is going to irrigated agriculture, and a majority of that is going is going to provide cattle feed, alfalfa and grass hay being used to produce dairy products and beef products. So steaks, hamburgers, yogurt, cheese, and what have you. So it's important to understand, I really drive this into the heads of my colleagues and my university students that in order to solve a problem like this, it's really important to get into the details of how the water is being consumed. So let's look first very quickly at the cities and the need to really shrink the water footprints of the cities. There is some extremely good news here. I think that most of you probably might have been thinking that the reason the Western US has all these water shortage crises is because they've got these big cities that are growing like weeds, and they've got green grassy lawns and golf courses and swimming pools and fountains, and think about Las Vegas. Well, it's a misperception. So here you can see that, I'm going to try to move that thing out of my way. You can see that for Phoenix, for example, 15% growth over the last couple of decades, and yet their total use of water has declined, not just stayed stable, but declined by 14%. And it's because the average household use, the average per person use, has gone down quite substantially by almost 30% over the last couple of decades. Similarly, we can look at Denver, Colorado, which also pulls Colorado River through the Rockies over to the Front Range of Colorado. Explosive growth over the last couple of decades, almost 30% growth, and yet they've been able to drop their use of water by 16% because the average per person use has gone down more than 40% over that time period. So the cities are doing miraculous things. And this is really coming about in two primary ways. They're ripping out their green grass lawns that require a lot of watering, and they're putting in more native plant species, or what we refer to as xeriscaping, drought tolerant species. It changes the look of the landscape, but it uses far less water. And a lot of people are really attracted, and this has become now more culturally desirable actually out in a lot of the Western cities. The other big thing is the switch from our old water guzzling toilets and washing machines and dishwashers and installing highly efficient plumbing fixtures. This alone has cut water use in the United States by a third, which is really quite remarkable, just by changing out household water fixtures, plumbing fixtures, toilets, dishwashers, and washing machines. And in the West, they are paying people to rip out their old water guzzling 6 gallon of flush toilets and replace them with toilets that only require a little bit more than a gallon. So they've gone from 6 gallons to 1 gallon with these high efficiency modes. So in the Colorado River system, the cities, the urban populations have grown by almost a quarter, 24%, but at the same time, their water use dropped by an average of 18%. And two-thirds of that miracle is attributable, as I said, to lowered average per person use, changing the landscaping and changing the plumbing fixtures. Lastly, that I'm going to touch on, because this is the big gorilla, it's 3/4 of the water used by people in the West and in the Colorado River system. So how can we do that? Well, we have a couple of options that are not being used at the level, and the shifts, the transitions aren't moving at the speed that they need to move in, as evidenced by the Colorado River system and these other Western river basins. We can shift cattle feeds from growing alfalfa into a far less water consuming crop, like what's called kernza. It's a crop native to Africa. They're experimenting now with using that as a replacement cattle feed. But there's lots of ways to shift from what we've been growing to what we could be growing, and keeping the farmers economically profitable. And you can see the level of savings that's potential. Pretty impressive, by doing what we call crop shifting. The primary strategy being used in the Colorado River Basin is to pay farmers to rest some portion of their farmland. And so when you do that, you go from using a whole bunch of water to using almost no water. The farmers are being compensated for the loss of their crop production as a result. In the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by the Biden administration, really attributable to a congressperson, a senator by the name of Kirsten Sinema, who was the senator for Arizona at the time. She got $4 billion included in the Inflation Reduction Act to go into the Colorado River system to pay farmers to rest their cropland to try to reduce how much water they were using. So there's another strategy. It's the primary one that's being used on an emergency basis to try to lower water consumption in the Colorado River system right now. But it still hasn't been enough, and it hasn't been not enough and not fast enough. Another thing that we're seeing out there on the farmlands is what we call repurposing. A lot of farmland is shifting into renewable energy production, solar farms, wind farms, and that kind of thing. They're even now starting to move toward what's called agrivoltaics, which is putting these panels up on stilts, raising them off the ground by 6 to 8 feet so that they can continue to grow a crop underneath the panels. So you don't necessarily have to lose all of the agricultural production by going to a strategy like agrivoltaics. So this is my last slide. I'm going to end on this note. The story here is that the Colorado River, at its tail end, where it used to flow through its delta in Mexico and down into the Gulf of California, it's been dry for decades. No water has made it into the Gulf of California. The place where these kids grew up in Mexico, throughout their lives, they had never seen water in this thing that was called the Colorado River. To them, it was just a big sandbox. But back in 2014, a bunch of conservation organizations got together, raised money to pay farmers in Mexico not to use as much water, and they stored that saved water in a reservoir right on the international border between U.S. and Mexico. They stored it up, the water that the farmers weren't needing to use, and in June of 2014, they let it rip. As a demonstration of what the river could be, as a way of demonstrating that The biological life will come back to these places. If you allow the water to flow again, you get cottonwoods and willows and fish moving back into the system out of the Gulf of California. But the thing that really strikes me, and the reason I like to end on this slide, is that look at the expression on these kids' faces. They're absolutely ecstatic. And to me, this says that if we can figure out how to restore the water, we can at the same time restore the human spirit. And so I'll leave you with that hopeful note. And for those of you that are interested in learning more about this, I wrote a little book back in 2014 called Chasing Water. And on my website or on Amazon.com, you can find this book quite readily. So finally, thank you for your patience. I went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I want to open it up to your questions now if I can.
Thanks so much, Brian. And yeah, go get that book. I got it when it came out, and I've given it for gifts, so it's worthwhile. Yeah, we have a number of questions, some in Q&A and some in chat. But Julian, can you help us wade through some of those?
Yeah, of course. So we have a few from Brenda, referring to the Australia graph in particular. She's wondering if the best case would be the light blue equal to the dark blue line in that graph.
Say that again. If the light blue is equal to the dark blue.
Yeah, if that would be the best case scenario.
Oh, um, well, Brenda, under that situation, you're using up all the water in the river. And so that means there's not a whole lot of water remaining in the river to support, recreation, aquatic life. There's a very, very important estuary at the bottom end of the Murray-Darling River system near Adelaide. And it's a biologically rich area where a lot of seafood is harvested out of that area. And so that area would be drying up as well. It wouldn't be receiving that fresh water flowing into that estuary area. And so, really, what you want to try to do, Brenda, the real goal is to try to allow enough water to stay in the river system to support biological life, environmental health, fisheries, recreation, and that sort of thing, and being careful not to take it all. So it would be less than those two lines meeting each other. It's a terrific question.
And then another one from Susan. She's saying federal requirements are to fortify streams and lakes for flood control. So it would seem that we would have both drought and flood concerns at the same time. Is that a correct way of thinking?
Yes, we are experiencing big challenges on both ends of the spectrum, as you're alluding to. So I focus my talk because my expertise is really honed in on this water scarcity, water shortage, not having enough water. But we're seeing, of course, many places. That horrible story of Central Texas over the July 4th weekend that killed so many kids and so many other people. We're seeing some pretty extreme floods at the same time. Um, Federal policies around these things have always struggled to keep up. And we are seeing those problems being accentuated with the changing climate. That's pretty well documented at this point. And there's quite a strong consensus that those problems are going to be further exacerbated as the climate continues to warm. And so federal policy has really struggled to keep up, as evidenced by the Colorado River system. You know, the the federal government works with the individual states to try to manage that system. And in fact, right now, the federal government is taking control of the Colorado River system, wresting control from the states because of this catastrophe that's unfolding. So the federal government does have a major role in water scarcity and water shortages. They also have a major role in things like flood control and flood damage compensation. Flood insurance is federal insurance. So hopefully that addressed your question on that one.
And then Jackie is wondering if the Saudis own or lease lots of alfalfa, and if you might know about that.
Yes, I do. So uh, the one strategy that I didn't mention at the top of my talk was this concept of what's called desalination, desalting salty water. It's mostly applied by taking water out of the ocean, running it through membranes, through filters to produce fresh water on the other side. The Saudis are the largest users or builders, developers of desalination plants anywhere in the world. And it's because there are no perennial rivers in Saudi Arabia. And historically, they were pumping their groundwater aquifers really, really fast, and they saw the groundwater level going down. They were worried that they weren't going to be able to reach the groundwater economically anymore. So they switched to starting to import their food from all over the world. Okay. One of the places that the Saudis import from is the Western United States. Much of the alfalfa being grown in the Western United States gets shipped to Saudi Arabia to dairy farms to produce dairy products in Saudi Arabia. The biggest importer of those crops, of those dairy feed crops, is China and Japan. But the Saudis are right behind. So there's been a lot of controversy over that, understandably, in the Western US. If you've got places like the Colorado River, where everybody's starting to see, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to grow our own food, generate our own electricity, supply public water supplies to our cities, that practice is coming under scrutiny and under controversy. And there was recently a decision in Arizona because the Saudis were growing alfalfa on state lands in Arizona. The state of Arizona canceled those leases to the Saudis because of that issue.
Okay, we're near the end, but if you got one more that you can find, Julian, that'd be good.
Yeah, one from Peggy. Would you comment on the water needs of data centers? And then, given that they're using water unsustainably already in so many places, what do you think that holds for the future?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it is a big concern. It's a big concern both for energy and for water use. Um, if you look at data centers and even the projected growth of data centers in the Western United States, it's a small portion of the total water use in the Western United States, but it's piggybacking on top of places which are already experiencing terrible water scarcity. So you go building data centers in the Colorado River system, you're just rubbing salt in the wound or whatever metaphor you want to use, right? You're just making it more challenging by allowing that to happen. In the eastern U.S., it's much more evident because by comparison, it becomes a substantial portion of municipal water supply systems, potentially. And so here, um, because we have a more abundant water supplies, we don't have water scarcity issues the way that the Western states do, but the use of water and the use of energy by data centers is a very, very big challenge in the Eastern United States, and it is adding to the problem in the Western United States, if that makes sense.
It does. And I would just say on behalf of Wild Virginia and our conservation partners in Virginia, we're looking really hard at how to handle the challenges with data centers. Probably a lot of you know that Northern Virginia is now the data center capital of the world.
Yeah.
And although we have more water than Arizona and a lot of other places, we're seeing streams, progressively, not just from that, but from all the purposes, climate change, streams going down year by year. So just a little commentary there.
Thank you.
Uh, and I'll say that I'll share the comment box stuff with you. There's lots of praise there for your talk, Brian, and some good comments, some ideas that we can share too. But then I'll just end by saying thanks so much. As I said, I always learn a lot. anytime I get to hear from you. And I am glad that you're able to show the positive as well as the scary and disturbing. Because we gotta work on it. We gotta solve it. So with that, I think we'll wrap up. And thanks, Brian. Thanks everybody for being here. It was great.